Hello, I'm Jane Kmentt from the European Leadership Network, and I'm delighted to be here today with Alexander Kmentt, who is the President-Designate of the first meeting of states parties of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will be happening later this month. Alexander is kindly engaged in an intensive and fascinating private discussion with our ELN members today. And we wanted to share some of his thoughts with a wider audience on these important issues. So Alexander, firstly, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the prohibition of nuclear weapons is something for which there's a very strong security argument. Can you set out briefly what that argument is?
I think the TPNW makes the realist case for nuclear disarmament based on evidence that we have on the humanitarian consequences, the breadth of short, mid, and long-term humanitarian consequences if nuclear weapons were to be used, on the one hand, and the risks, the whole variety of risks of something, of making this more likely or a possibility, from human error to accidents, to miscalculations, and of course to intentional use. So if you look at the extent of the consequences, and if you look at the extent of the risks, the nuclear deterrence paradigm becomes very shaky. So the argument of the TPNW is that, on balance, by looking at this evidence, the argument that nuclear weapons can be a sustainable ultimate guarantee for security doesn't hold, because the risks and consequences are too grave. And that is an argument that is supported by the TPNW states parties. But I would argue that that is an argument that has support much more widely, certainly among the non-nuclear weapon states who do not rely on nuclear weapons, which are, of course, about 150 of the 190 plus UN member states. So it makes the case that it makes the realist case, and by inversion, the belief that nuclear deterrence is going to hold, that nothing's going to happen, looks much more like a idealist or utopian wishful thinking. And of course, we hope that that is going to be the case, but it is extremely risky to basically bet the future of all humanity on the assumptions that underpin nuclear deterrence.
Clearly, these arguments have convinced a large number of governments and parliaments which have ratified the treaty. But at the same time, of course, the nuclear armed states are very critical of the treaty, as you'd expect. So with this divide, what do you expect will realistically come out of the conference?
Well, first of all, this is the first meeting of a new treaty. It's the first time we get together to decide on how to proceed. Let me remind you that it was only 20 plus years after the NPT entered into force that China and France became states parties. So it is we know we are not naive about the challenges and about the difficulties of making progress on the nuclear weapons issue. We are a young treaty. I think the story is really amazing how quickly the treaty entered into force, despite the opposition that we faced. So we are putting the implementation of this treaty on a track. I've explained in the meeting before that there are a whole range of important substantive decisions to be taken. And we know that ultimately this is a long-term and discursive process, which will take a lot of time. But we are very convinced about the veracity of the profound arguments on which this treaty is based, that will have an impact in the discourse on these weapons internationally and, of course, in individual states. So none of what we see or take for granted in the nuclear weapons debate is ultimately cast in stone. We make arguments we are putting the TPNW forward as a powerful argumentative proposition, discursive proposition, and we know that we will not be able to coerce anyone to get rid of nuclear weapons. We will try to convince. So first step is that this treaty entered into force. Second step is to make the implementation credible and bring in more countries on board and work on it. I think that's the plan. We don't expect that at the first meeting of states parties we will suddenly, with a magic wand, solve all the nuclear weapons issues. We are putting this treaty on track. I think that's the expectation.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We hope to connect with you again after the conference and hear more about the next steps.